Donald Trump is once again in the spotlight, and this time not because of another legal battle, but thanks to a phone call with none other than Vladimir Putin. Yes, indeed, the former president of the United States has declared that he has a brilliant plan to end the conflict in Ukraine. And apparently this plan is so simple and effective that everything could be over very quickly, as if this were not a war but some kind of real estate sale. One call and the deal is done. Of course, the very fact of the conversation is beyond doubt. Trump personally confirmed it in an interview with the New York Post, sitting aboard his presidential plane. Where else, right? Apparently, the altitude gives his words more weight. Now, the only question is how far their negotiations went, and what exactly the two leaders discussed behind closed lines. Did they get down to specific terms, or was it just an exchange of pleasantries? Although, if we are to believe Trump, he clearly sees himself as the only person on the planet capable of resolving this conflict, while everyone else is just wasting time. And here comes the classic Trump act, the self-styled messiah descending from the mountaintop with a ready plan in hand. The details of this miracle solution, of course, remain undisclosed, probably to keep the intrigue alive. Is it about some diplomatic concessions, unprecedented economic pressure, or perhaps Trump is once again relying on his legendary art of the deal, where everything is resolved through sheer personal charisma and a few bold statements? In any case, he insists that people need to stop suffering, and he knows exactly how to make that happen. The only problem is that his method remains shrouded in mystery. What makes this even more amusing is Trump's signature way of dodging direct questions about the conversation's details. When journalists tried to find out how long the call lasted, he mysteriously replied, "I'd rather not say." Of course, after all, leaving room for speculation is far more dramatic than giving a straight answer. But like the showman he is, Trump still threw in a bit of suspense, hinting that Putin also wants to stop human losses. Now the real question is, was this a genuine indication of upcoming negotiations, or just another episode of the political reality show where every word is carefully scripted for maximum media impact? Naturally, there was also the inevitable jab at Joe Biden. As always, Trump made sure to remind everyone that he had a much better relationship with Putin than the current president does, while also calling Biden a disgrace to the country. But at this point, that's just his standard refrain, repeated in every speech. What really matters is that Trump is once again positioning himself as the man who can negotiate even with Russia, unlike Biden, who, according to his opponent, is only making things worse. But the most intriguing question remains, will this phone call lead to an actual step toward peace, or is it just another pre-election stunt? Grand promises of an immediate end to the conflict sound great, but who will deal with the details? Trump insists that if he had been president in the year 2022, the war would never have happened. A very convenient narrative, especially when there is no need to prove it in practice. Now we just have to see whether he actually has any leverage to back up his words, or if this is just another explosive headline for the press. Well, of course, everything is as usual. Ambitions and plans on paper, while reality, as always, turns out to be something entirely different. The American leader, supposedly driven by noble intentions, is planning to put a pause on the hostilities and then, supposedly, sit down at the negotiating table. Well, who would have thought? Retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg once again confirmed all of this on the pages of the New York Post, generously explaining that this kind, a peace-loving Trump primarily intends to stop the killings, and apparently that is at least twice as important to him as any actual agreements. I wouldn't be surprised if the next headline reads, "Trump decides to stop all wars in the world if the negotiation process doesn't work." Such a kind old man. But if we set aside the idealistic musings in practice, this looks like a straightforward attempt to pressure Russia into negotiations by simply putting the fighting on hold. And here's where things get interesting. For Russia, such a pause is, to put it mildly, not the most enticing opportunity. Lavrov has already prepared a clever response, stating that Moscow is, of course, ready for negotiations, but pauses in hostilities are not their thing. Why take a break when the picture isn't finished in one go? There were already attempts at this in Istanbul, and we all remember how that turned out. But apparently that won't stop Trump. If Moscow says no, then it looks like the good old methods will come into play. Sanctions. Oh, those sanctions. A long-standing story, and every time they seem to get stronger and scarier. This time, Trump seems intent on hitting the most vulnerable spot, Russia's oil industry. No surprise there, as energy has always been a weak point. And now, a fresh round of sanctions could close off the last loopholes, making life even harder for Russia's economy. Delightful, isn't it? Who doesn't love a bit of pressure? The question, of course, remains, Will these sanctions really be as devastating as Washington envisions? Because the Russian economy has already adapted quite skillfully to previous blows. Yes, sanctions certainly work, but not to the extent that Russia hasn't found ways to bypass and adapt to them. So now we have to wonder, can Trump offer something more substantial than yet another round of restrictions? Or is this just campaign rhetoric, designed for those eagerly awaiting news of how America is defeating Russia through economic pressure? Donald Trump, as always, makes bold statements, promising to deal a blow to Russia's economy so severe that Moscow simply won't recover. Or is this just more empty talk to grab attention? How many times have we heard about this decisive strike? Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has tirelessly and quite effectively maneuvered around all these sanctions like a skilled chess player, rather than some petty thief. But now it turns out the Trump administration is supposedly ready to take things to the next level. And how exactly do they think this will play out? Washington, despite its vast experience in imposing sanctions, insists that all previous measures were merely a warm-up. Keith Kellogg, Trump's chief advisor, has declared that all the sanctions the United States has imposed on Russia so far were just scratches on the surface. Expect, they say, a real strike that will destroy Russia's economy. That certainly sounds like some kind of battle cry, doesn't it? Destroy, obliterate, crush. But Russia has always known how to adapt, and neither sanctions nor threats have been able to break it. And here we go again, the same old tune. Trump is ready to take steps that will be even more painful. Kellogg directly points to the weak spots of the Russian economy, and of course, oil is at the center of it all. Russia relies on oil revenues. If we want to, we can simply cut off that flow, he declared. Yes, it sounds threatening, like something out of a blockbuster, only with real consequences for the economy. Because no matter what we say, Russian oil is that very vital sector that keeps the treasury filled. A blow to it is like taking a team out of the game by removing its star striker. But the question remains, can the US actually block this flow? Then comes another interesting point, the financial system. Keith Kellogg is convinced that Russia has already found ways to bypass sanctions, but the US knows how to shut down all those loopholes. And when they claim that they control the global financial system far more deeply than Russia thinks, it seems they're not exaggerating. Washington has always been a master of manipulating financial markets. The next step, according to Kellogg, is to block all possible escape routes for Moscow. And that's where the real question arises. Can the Kremlin once again navigate its way through this economic maze? Maybe Trump is saying this for a domestic audience. Maybe it's just part of the election games, but one thing is clear. The stakes are rising. Moscow is not going to back down, which means this economic war will continue, and it's unlikely to be decided by just one round of sanctions. But the ultimate question remains, who will come out on top in this ongoing exchange of blows and threats? And here comes Russia's response. As always, with a smile and a calmness that any Zen master would envy. The Kremlin isn't losing sleep over Washington's threats. Dmitry Peskov, as usual, dismisses the statements of American officials, declaring that there's nothing new here for Russia. All these threats, as you might have guessed, have simply become part of the Kremlin's daily routine. And then comes the classic line, Russia is ready for any scenario because at this point, sanctions are neither a surprise nor a source of fear. But here's what's worth considering. Behind this calm mask may lie a much harsher response than they want us to believe. The Kremlin isn't just sitting idly by, it is actively preparing countermeasures. Behind closed doors, they are already ramping up their powers to seize foreign assets. Western companies, financial institutions, they are all in the crosshairs. Moscow is no longer just passively waiting for the next sanctions package. If America decides to escalate this economic war again, the Kremlin won't just respond with verbal jabs. Get ready for real action. And here's where it gets really interesting. Russia's main weapon, as always, is in the energy sector. It's no coincidence that Moscow has been busy forging strategic alliances with China, India, and other nations that, like Russia, are keen on weakening Western financial dominance. These countries are actively developing alternative mechanisms that aim to overshadow US influence in the global economy. With this kind of tandem, it's not too difficult to create exit routes from the system that the West never even dreamed of. And Putin, as always, remains cold-blooded, like a hedgehog in the fog. In one of his rare direct comments, he calls Trump a pragmatic leader who supposedly acts based on rational and calculated decisions. Trump is not an ideologue. He is, first and foremost, a businessman, says the Russian president, making it clear that any economic blow to Moscow, like any strong businessman, will inevitably affect the entire global economy. And the United States itself as well. Let's not forget. But here we come to the most interesting interesting moment. His words contain not just an observation, but also a very specific warning. Putin declares, if Trump wants to double the sanctions, let him try. But the consequences of this blow will be felt not only by Moscow, but far beyond its borders. The stakes are rising, and this time, the Kremlin is definitely not going to stay silent and watch as it gets cornered by sanctions. And just when we might want to think that America holds all the cards, Putin reminds us that the West also has its pressure points. You speak of sanctions, but forget about energy resources, without which you cannot survive, warns the Russian president. Metals essential for industry, rare earth elements without which modern electronics are impossible. This is where the Kremlin may play its trump card. Moscow can turn all of this against its Western opponents. So it seems the stakes are truly unbelievably high this time. The Kremlin reacted cautiously to media reports about a phone conversation between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. The Russian president's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, made a statement that, as expected in such situations, leaves room for interpretation. I can neither confirm nor deny, Peskov noted diplomatically, explaining that under current conditions, Washington communicates through various channels, and he may not be aware of all the nuances. On the surface, nothing unusual. A standard response meant either to buy time or to hint that the conversation may have indeed taken place. But the Kremlin is in no hurry to turn it into a sensation. However, this ambiguity holds the key political subtext. Trump, on the other hand, did not maintain complete silence, but also refrained from speaking openly. He simply threw out a cryptic, "I'd rather not say," further fueling speculation about a possible dialogue. From his words, one can infer that the conversation touched on the Ukrainian conflict, and that Putin, according to the American leader, allegedly expressed concern over human casualties. A rather unexpected rhetoric, considering that public statements from Russian authorities rarely contain such emotional accents. This could either be an attempt by Trump to portray Putin in a more humanitarian light, or an effort by the American side to create the appearance that peace negotiations are underway. And of course, we must not forget the most important thing, the mysterious concrete plan that, according to Trump, could end the war. Formally, Moscow has repeatedly stated its readiness for negotiations, but only with due consideration of Russian interests. Putin, for example, confirmed back in late January that he was open to dialogue with Trump should such a conversation actually take place. Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, also emphasized that Moscow is always prepared to discuss key issues with the United States, but only in light of the new realities. And now, as information about a possible contact between the two leaders leaks to the press, a very logical question arises. Is this a genuine attempt to initiate dialogue or just another performance for the public? It is entirely possible that both sides are merely laying the groundwork for future negotiations, testing the reaction of the public and political elites. After all, in the world of high politics, any word spoken or left unsaid at the right moment can be decisive. This is classic political maneuvering, with the Kremlin choosing not to lay all its cards on the table. When rumors surfaced in the media about a potential phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, the Kremlin, as expected, reacted with restraint. Dmitry Peskov, the president's press secretary, routinely stated that he could neither confirm nor deny these reports. Sounds perfectly diplomatic and in line with Russian political tradition, doesn't it? On the one hand, it's nothing surprising, a standard response that allows room for interpretation and maneuvering. But in this very "I cannot say anything" lies the real political subtext, because in essence, Peskov is hinting that the conversation very well might have taken place, but the Kremlin is not about to turn it into a media spectacle. All of this resembles nothing less than a classic political tactic. Trump, however, chose not to remain silent, but he also refrained from revealing any details. Instead, he threw out a cryptic, "I'd rather not say," which of course only fueled more speculation. And if we are to believe his words, the conversation with Putin touched on the Ukrainian conflict. Trump claims that the Russian president allegedly expressed concern over human casualties, an emotional emphasis that is difficult to imagine in public statements from Russian officials, given their usual reserved and calculated tone. Trump, it seems, is casting himself in the role of a peacemaker, attempting to portray Putin in a more humanitarian light, as if he is worried about the fate of people rather than geopolitical interests. And here arises an interesting question. Is Trump trying to create the illusion that peace negotiations are truly underway? This too is a highly convenient public narrative, especially on the eve of elections. If we assume the conversation did take place, another thought immediately comes to mind. Could this so-called concrete plan that Trump mentioned be nothing more than another ploy to manipulate public opinion? Because if Trump plans to claim that he has found a solution for peace in Ukraine, it would undoubtedly be a powerful move, especially when framed within the context of his upcoming election campaign. On the other hand, the Kremlin has repeatedly raised the issue of its readiness for negotiations, but with a clear stipulation that everything will happen only with due consideration of Russia's interests. Back in January, Putin stated that he was open to dialogue with Trump should such a conversation actually take place. Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, also emphasized that Moscow is always open to discussing key issues with the United States, but of course strictly in light of the new realities. Now that the media is flooded with rumors about a possible contact between the two leaders, a perfectly logical question arises. Is this just a performance for the public? Is it groundwork for negotiations or an attempt to test how society and political elites will react to such news? In the world of high-stakes politics, every word matters. Fail to say the right thing at the right time, and you lose. So perhaps we are witnessing the careful preparation of the ground for future negotiations, talks that for now are not meant to be openly discussed. Subscribe so you don't miss the hottest news and exclusive analysis. All the best, and see you in the next episodes.